So welcome everybody. Thanks for coming. Trust me, you chose the right session to be in.
We hope.
You're going to get your money's worth today. So, hi William.
Hi.
I want to thank William for taking the time to be with us. You know, William and I were chatting about Buffett's notion that the truly successful people say no to almost everything. And I believe that, and I think William believes that. And then I asked him if he would fly from New York to come and speak at this conference, which he usually would get paid a lot of money to do. And he didn't say no. When he heard it was for charity, he said yes, and he came. So very thankful that you could be here. William's a real mensch, and I think you're going to learn a lot. So I've read his book now about 5 times. Take the book home, read it. You're going to love it. He's done an incredible job of distilling some really fundamental wisdom about life, not just about investing, but really about life. And he's very modest, so he won't tell you this, but Charlie Munger called this one of the best investing books he's ever read. So even though I believe it happens to be one of the best investing books I've ever read, take it from Charlie Munger. Okay, so to set the table, I'm going to read a couple of quotes from the introduction of the book. So one of the best reasons to study Investor Spotlight in this book is that you can teach us not only how to become rich, but how to improve the way we think and reach decisions. We can learn from the way these legends manage their time, construct a calm environment in which to think, whom they hang out with and steer clear of, how they guard against biases and blind spots, how they learn from mistakes and avoid repeating them, how they handle stress and adversity, how they think about honesty and integrity, how they spend money and give it away, and how they attempt to build lives imbued with a meaning that transcends money. And that's really what I loved about William's book. It's really not about how to get stinking rich. It's more about how you live a life in a way that's congruent with your values. And in the cases of a lot of these, legends of investing, there are quirks and idiosyncrasies too. So we'll just do a quick introduction to get to know William. So before we unpack your perspectives on how we can live richer and wiser, happier lives, maybe we can just hear more about you, your family, and how you managed to pivot from, journalism to being an author.
Sure, thank you. First of all, thank you all so much for coming. It's lovely to see you all. In a way, it's like a cosmic joke that I'm here talking to an investment audience, and I have an intense amount of imposter syndrome for about 350 days a year. Once in a while, it calms down. Because I went to Eton where, all these posh Brits like Boris Johnson and David Cameron and Prince Harry and Prince Charles went. And then I went to Oxford to study English literature. And I came out thinking I was going to be a novelist or write, beautiful, long-form nonfiction for The New Yorker. And I had no interest in the world of money and investing. I mean, I thought it was kind of crass, and anyone who cared about money and business and investing was sort of vulgar. And really, I should focus on these high-flown things like becoming a famous novelist. And then at some point in my mid-20s, I sold an apartment that my brother and I had owned together in London. And so I had to figure out what to do with the money. And I start reading about the stock market, and I'm like, wait a second, this is just the coolest thing. You can make money without having to get your hands dirty just by thinking. And because I was kind of lazy, this just appealed to me massively. And so I start reading obsessively about this. And then because I was a young journalist writing for all of these magazines like Forbes and Fortune and Money and Time and Barron's over the years, lots of different publications, I actually was able to have the excuse of calling all of these legendary investors and saying to someone like Sir John Templeton, by the way, could I come spend a day with you in the Bahamas? And they would say, yeah. And so I would get to interview all of these people like Jack Bogle, the patron saint of indexing who founded Vanguard, or I'd get to interview Peter Lynch or Sir John Templeton or Mark Mobius, aka the Bald Eagle, who would fly around in a Gulfstream jet with gold-plated fixtures that he'd bought from, I think, some Saudi tycoon who'd become over-leveraged and had to sell it at a bargain price. And so gradually, I went from thinking, okay, this is great, I can get rich without actually having to do anything, to thinking, these are pretty interesting people and actually really quite amazing characters that nobody's really writing about as a story. And so I would see someone like Templeton, who was probably the greatest global investor of the 20th century, and I would start interviewing people about him as well as interviewing him, and they would say, yeah, the first time I went to meet John, he said, meet me at 4:11, I have another meeting at 4:17. I thought, these are really weird dudes. And, it just became like this sort of obsession. And then gradually over the years, I realized that I'd probably spent more time than pretty much anybody else in the world with famous investors. And I thought, I should actually start to figure out like what we can learn from them. And I shifted from really writing about just how to get rich, which was clearly a part of it and is part of how you seduce people into reading this stuff, to thinking, well, actually, these are some of the smartest, most pragmatic, most thoughtful people in the world. How do they think about other issues? Like, how do they think about dealing with uncertainty, for example, the fact that we have to make decisions about the future, and yet none of us knows what the future holds. And so if you look in the book, you'll see these stories that really, in a way, they're almost like philosophical, because I would go interview someone like Joe Greenblatt, for example, who's one of the most successful hedge fund managers of all time, who I think he averaged 40% a year for 20 years, which means you basically turn $1 million into $836 million, which is a pretty nifty trick. And he told me this story about when he was a young hedge fund manager just starting out. And he said, yeah, I invested in this really riskless arbitrage deal in this company in Florida. And one day I open up the Wall Street Journal and I see that the pavilion of this company has just fallen into a sinkhole. And he's like, I would have thought it was funny if not for the fact that it just scared the wits out of me because it was going to destroy my business. And his main investor was Michael Milken. So you think about that and you think, that's a beautiful metaphor for what we're all facing in life, which is, we live in a world where the thing you invest in can suddenly fall into a sinkhole. So how the hell do you make decisions? How do you stack the odds in your favor so that you're going to survive, so that you're going to thrive? And so it became almost like a sort of philosophical and spiritual inquiry, really. And so for me, in a way, markets have become kind of a microcosm of life. And it's the added beauty is the fact that A, you can get rich doing it if you think well, and B, not have to really get your hands dirty and work for anyone you dislike, which is something that is profoundly important to me.
Okay. So I got William's book from a money manager named Monish Pabrai, who we were allocating money to back in the good old days when I was at Prime Quadrant. And I was lucky enough just to end up on his book list. So every year he sends a book. So this one's from Monish. And I loved the book. And I reached out to William during COVID and asked him to do a Zoom call with our investors. And he graciously agreed. And that's how we came to know each other. But
I'm terrible at saying no to anything. Please don't ask me to do anything.
I'll keep asking. But so Monish is an interesting guy. He's a ruthless cloner. And so the first chapter in the book profiles Monish. I'm going in the assumption that most people in this room have either satisfied the richer part or are well on their way to satisfying the richer part. And probably we're all struggling a little bit with the wiser and the happier parts. There are always these things that we're dealing with. And there's a lot of wisdom that comes from each of these investors for all of those elements. But maybe you can share with us, Monish, who's been phenomenally successful as an investor. What lessons did you take from him on the whole wiser and happier part of life?
Sure. Monish is a fascinating guy. And when I started the book, it's a ridiculous project, this. I spent 5 years working on the book without taking a vacation. And right at the start, before even I got a book deal, I went to India with Monish and spent five days traveling across India with him. We even, this is not something you usually do as a reporter. I shared a bunk bed with him on an all-night train from Kota to Mumbai. It was quite a memorable experience. And the reason I wanted to start the book with Monish is that we had gone to Omaha one year together. He's someone I've interviewed a lot over the years, and he's become a good friend. We'd gone to Omaha together, and my friend Guy Spear, who's another well-known hedge fund manager, who's probably Monish's closest friend, had rented a NetJets plane because Buffett owns NetJets. And so we're flying back on this NetJets plane to New York. And the subject of the conversation the whole way with Guy and Monish and me is this whole idea of the inner scorecard, of how to live by an inner scorecard, which is something that Buffett talks a lot about. And so Buffett would talk about, he said, you have to live by an inner scorecard, and you could tell whether you live by an inner scorecard by asking a simple question, which is, would you prefer to be known publicly as the best lover in the world, but actually secretly to be the worst? Or would you prefer to be known publicly as the worst lover in the world, but actually secretly to be the best? And so this whole subject of thinking for yourself, you can send in your answers later, thinking for yourself, thinking very independently was kind of a central part of this conversation. And so I'd seen the way Monish thinks, and I just thought, this guy has this kind of riveting brain, and nobody really knows just how impressive this guy is. So I traveled with him to India, and really what we're exploring through much of our conversations over 5 days, and me madly taking notes, is this one concept of cloning, which is Monish's very unromantic term for basically replication, mimicry. It's reverse engineering what people who are smarter and wiser than you have already figured out, and then saying, well, let me replicate this with relentless attention to detail. And instead of trying to reinvent the wheel, see if actually I can win the game without being original. And there's something so profoundly provocative about this idea that you don't have to be original in terms of, to succeed, that I decided this is going to be the focus of a chapter. And Monish had done this with investing. He basically reverse engineered what Buffett and Munger had figured out, and was playing this 30-year game to try to turn $1 million into $1 billion, basically just by cloning what they had figured out about investing. And at a certain point, after making a fortune in the stock market, he decides, well, I'm going to clone what Buffett has done with the giving back, because Buffett's also obviously become an extraordinary philanthropist. So he starts looking around, he starts thinking, well, if I were to die today, who would I give my money to? And he couldn't really find anything he wanted to give his money to. And then he realizes, well, I want something where the results are really tangible, where you can really track what it does. So very much a hedge fund manager's approach to philanthropy in a way. And so he finds this charity called the Super 30, where a brilliant mathematician in Bihar province in India, this very poor province, would take 30 brilliant kids a year, high school kids, and would train them, give them 2 years of free coaching. And then they would take the exam to the Indian Institutes of Technology, which, as many of you will know, is the Indian equivalent of MIT, but much harder to get into. Has something like a 1.3% acceptance rate. And once they got in, then you'd be hired by Microsoft or Google, all of these amazing global countries. So you could yank these kids out of poverty with nothing. And so Monish asked this guy, this math teacher, if he can give him money. And the guy's like, no, I can't go above this scale of 30 kids a year. So Monish asked for permission to reverse engineer it, and then creates this charity through his Dakshina Foundation. Dakshina means gift in Sanskrit, where he basically takes on an industrial scale what this math teacher has done. And he's managed to figure out how to train thousands and thousands of kids at this unbelievably low price so that they can get into the Indian Institutes of Technology. And I think I was looking at it earlier, and it's several thousand kids already. And so there are some really important lessons here, right? So one time I'd meet this guy, Ashok Talapatra, who's one of the great kind of graduates of this program. This is while we were in India visiting various schools in rural India that Monish had bankrolled. And Ashok came from I think his father made $100 a month, if I remember rightly, as a tailor. And they lived in a $6 a month home in a slum in Hyderabad. And Monish had visited, and there was like a pink shower curtain as the front door, and they had an asbestos roof that would just sort of flood during the monsoon. And they didn't have a coffee table, so when Monish went to eat there, they just put out a little stool with chai and some treats on it. So incredibly poor. And Ashok, who's absolutely brilliant and also charming, comes 63rd out of 461,000 people in the entrance exam to the IITs, goes to IIT Mumbai, gets a 6-figure job at Google, and now has been climbing for the last 10 years at Google, worked in Mountain View, went to work in London, now is working in Zurich. And so you see Monish's life and you think, well, wait a second, so here's this really odd guy who's figured out how to make a mispriced bet, how to take a mispriced stock, sit quietly in a room, see once every few months there's something that becomes really mispriced. And he's taken that weird skill and he's used it to transform really tens of thousands of lives. And so one of the things that's really important, I think, as a takeaway, especially at a charitable event like this, or a really wonderful event, is when you look at why Monish is happy. It's not because he's made an absolute fortune as an investor and probably will end up as a billionaire. The highlight of his year is actually going to these kind of destitute villages around rural India and visiting the students before they climb and get into IIT. And so recently he went to some rural town where he went to this kid's house, and the kid, it's in the mountains, and everyone's it's on the border with Bangladesh, and they're like living off goats and chickens, and I mean, just no money, and it's all flooded. It's almost impossible to get there. And he said it was really like one of the happiest days of the year. He's like, this is the highlight of my year. And he went with this guy, the Colonel Sharma, who used to run the charity for 1 rupee a year. And the Colonel was just sort of crying seeing this, and he was just so happy because they're seeing the transformation of other people's lives. So this was one of the most important things I realized actually as I was writing about the greatest investors, is the ones who are happiest are actually the ones who are not so focused on themselves. There are these kind of dysfunctional, slightly sociopathic billionaire investors who I think are pretty happy just focusing on themselves. But the ones who you would look at and you'd actually want to sit next to at dinner are the ones who are taking the fact that they have this gift for making money, and there's this kind of circularity to it where they're giving, so they receive, so they give more, and there's something really beautiful about it. And before I let you go on after my world's longest answer, Monish has this lovely daughter who's becoming a hedge fund manager as well, who's got the best name. She's called Monish Pabrai. And Monsoon told me a couple of years ago, she's like, yeah, I have a tattoo of the Dakshana symbol. She's like, I don't have a tattoo of Pabrai Fund's symbol. And the thing that she's really deeply proud of actually is the fact that they've yanked all these kids out of poverty. And she's become friends with Ashok. And I see Ashok comes to Omaha for the Berkshire Hathaway annual meeting. And there was a time where I sort of thought, I kept being reminded of this kind of Talmudic saying that I think I'll probably gobble it, but it was something like, if you save one life, you save the world. And I would say this to Monish, and Monish is like just this great pragmatist. And he's like, no, you just try not to make the world a worse place. So there's something deeply pragmatic. He's not kind of smug or sanctimonious or self-congratulatory about it, but he's just quietly using his rational brain to lift thousands of kids out of poverty. And that has had so many good effects, not only on these kids, but also on him in this ironic way. So this is why Buffett and Munger became very close to him. Munger basically adopted him as a sort of mentee. And it's just transformed Monish's life. So there's a sort of, there's so many lessons in that. But I think if there's a takeaway for us, it's if you're trying to clone the most successful investors, don't forget to clone the bit that actually makes for a happy and rich life, which is this kind of circularity, this sharing, using your gift to lift up other people.
Yeah. What's amazing, so Melody, by the way, whoever was in that session, which was spectacular, and she talked about how if you're born in North America, you kind of won the genetic lottery, right? You're born into a place of abundance, but if these kids in India are the exact opposite, right? They have not won that lottery, yet he's found a way of taking the poorest of the poor, and they're brilliant. These are brilliant children. And
when I said to Ashok, is there anyone in your family you took after? Like, where do you get your brain? He's like, yeah, my father's brilliant. Yeah. And he said he's a superb mathematician. His father's worked as an apprentice, worked as a tailor for all these years, making $100 a month. And it resonated deeply with me because I had a grandfather called Henry, who my son is named after, who was brilliant and left school at 12 because basically he had this in London. He had newspaper in the bottom of his soles because the shoes had worn out so much. And at a certain point, the sole couldn't even hold the newspaper because there was nothing left. And my grandfather was an international class bridge player. So here's a guy who could remember where all of the cards were, and he became an apprentice tailor. And when I mentioned that to Monish, he's like, oh yeah, like some of those guys, they have serious firepower, and we'll just never discover it. So the ability to take someone who is going to fall through the net and give them a life, I think there's almost nothing more righteous than that.
Yeah, it's beautiful. Okay, so you mentioned Charlie Munger. And Monish actually ended up becoming friends with Munger, and Munger was a mentor to him. Munger said, it's remarkable how much long-term advantage people like us have gotten by trying to be consistently not stupid. instead of trying to be very intelligent. Buffett said this of Munger. He said, Charlie was the architect of the present Berkshire, and I acted as the general contractor to carry out the day-to-day construction of his vision. So Munger, highly respected by Buffett, an absolute genius, and we're well served studying his philosophies. And one of my favorite chapters in your book is entitled Don't Be a Fool, and it profiles Charlie and some of his wisdom that you derived from him when you interviewed him. So you touch on things like compounding knowledge and the concept of inversion, avoiding negative emotions like envy and facing adversity and many others. I'm wondering if you could just expand on some of the wisdom that you gleaned from your time with Charlie about living a richer, wiser, and happier life.
Sure. I was very struck. Well, I'll tell you first. In a way, this is the opposite extreme from my Monish story, where I had kind of unlimited access to Monish for many, many days over several years. With Munger, I wrote to him and I basically said, I'm coming to California for the Daily Journal meeting, because he was chairman of a company called Daily Journal, in addition to being Buffett's right-hand man at Berkshire Hathaway. I said, I'm coming, and I wondered if I could interview you, and I said who I was and stuff. And I get this message back saying, from his long-term assistant saying, Mr. Munger will meet you for 10 minutes before the meeting. So I'm in this crazy position where I fly 3,000 miles to spend 10 minutes with this guy. And I remember this moment where I'm standing outside my kitchen in New York, and I'm just going, yes! The idea that I'm going to get to go meet this sage, who's utterly brilliant, was so profoundly thrilling and terrifying, because Munger had this reputation for being fearsomely brusque and not suffering fools gladly. And Buffett always said that Munger had the greatest 30-second mind in the world, that before you even finish your sentence, he saw the essence of everything. So I'm like preparing for weeks in advance for my 10-minute interview, which ended up, I ended up getting more time with him. And then crazily, a year or so after the book came out, I ended up being invited to a 2-hour Zoom breakfast with him, which was an extraordinary experience. I thought I was being pranked when they invited me. But so because I didn't have very long with him, I had to figure out, so what's the most important thing? And so the way I think of this is, okay, what's the eye of the bullseye? And to me, the eye of the bullseye with Munger is this very simple idea that instead of trying to be the smartest person in the world, which I certainly am going to fail at, what I want to do is reduce what he called standard stupidities. And he had a great way with words, so he would say asininities and inanities and absurdities. And so you just go through life very consciously and systematically saying, how do people screw up? Let me not do that. And so Munger, when I first went into the room, I said to him, because I didn't have time to mess around, there was no sort of preamble, and I said, Mr. Munger, I regard you as the grandmaster of stupidity reduction. And I said, why do you take that approach? And he said, because it works, it just works. And so what Munger does, what Munger did, he passed away about a month before his 100th birthday last year. What Munger would do is he would systematically collect examples of ways that individuals, families, companies, investments went wrong. And he would say, what stupid behavior led to this disaster? And so if you think about the ways that investors screw up, it's incredibly predictable, right? You just collect all these examples of people who get over-leveraged, or they put all of their money in the hottest thing, or they don't keep an eye on expenses. And so the fees and expenses gradually kind of corrode their profits, or they try to time the market, jump in and out, which basically everyone I interviewed, all of these famous investors, thought was kind of futile, with the possible exception, I think, of someone like Ray Dalio, maybe. And even there, I think he would think it was futile too. So that was an incredibly powerful lesson. But then at the end of the Daily Journal meeting, I get to ask these follow-up questions. And so there's a sort of little group of these kind of disciples who've gathered from around the world to listen to Charlie. And I said to him, so if we're trying to clone you and Warren and we want to figure out how to have a happy life, what's replicable? And he immediately starts talking about relationships, and immediately starts talking about how we've had these amazing relationships with our colleagues, with the CEOs who are running our companies, with each other. He says, Warren's been a marvelous partner to me, and I've been a good partner to him. And he says, we have a really simple system. And he says, if you want to have a good partner, be a good partner. And he says, likewise, if you want to have a good spouse, deserve one. And so this to me was incredibly powerful, because here you have this guy, then 93, I guess, basically distilling all of this practical, pragmatic wisdom. And instead of saying, yeah, think about, what your partner can do to you, and approach life as a sort of zero-sum game where you try to get the best deal out of your partner. He's like, no, you show up for the other person. You be the partner that you would want them to be. And this has had a profound impact on me, because I started to think, okay, so if I apply that, instead of thinking, why don't I have better friends? Let me try to be a better friend. Let me try to show up for my friends. And so I would start to do things where, I had a wonderful guy on the Rich, Wiser, Happier podcast that I did, which is much easier than writing. A wonderful guy called Christopher Begg, who teaches the class at Columbia that Ben Graham taught, that Buffett took with Ben Graham back in 1951. And I became friends with him after he came on the podcast, and I thought, yeah, I'm just going to go to Costa Rica and just go visit Chris. And that's a direct result of studying the great investors and realizing actually that in the same way that I said before, you want to have this kind of flow of energy where you're not just, I'm just going to take all the money for myself. You want to share and you want to lift up other people. In the same way, there's this irony that I study all these great investors and think it's going to teach me to become, really rich without getting my hands dirty. And I'm like, actually what it really taught me is that a rich life is really going to depend on the quality of my relationships. And so again, this is something that's so easily clonable for all of you, where we all know this already, but to have a 93-year-old who's incredibly smart like Munger tell you it's all relationships, I've found just incredibly helpful.
You talked just before we switched gears from Munger, the one thing that resonated with me was his dispassionate ability to say, well, this emotion is stupid. So just don't do it. I mean, I have a problem with that. I can't. I try, and intellectually I'm like, yeah, okay, don't do that. But he seems to be able to actually live that. Can you just explain his analysis in that?
Yeah, one of the, when you think about the many ways in which Munger would go through life saying, well, let me not do this because it's stupid and destructive and self-destructive, one of the things that he said people systematically get wrong is that they're too emotional. They let their emotions lead them to do really dumb things. And so he said these emotions like self-pity or anger or a resentment or a desire for revenge, he's like, they're just stupid. And he said, envy is the dumbest of the 7 deadly sins because it's not even fun. And so, so I said to him, well, how do you prevent yourself getting angry, or how do you prevent yourself from being vengeful or whatever? And he said, I know these things are stupid. So he's like, I just don't let them run. And he said, actually, I don't let them start. And he said, I'm trying all day long to be less stupid. And so this is, again, very, very helpful. It's very practical, pragmatic advice, because every time I start to feel full of self-pity, or I start to feel a sense of envy or anger, I still feel those emotions. But I can sort of say, it's just self-destructive. It's just not helpful. And that perspective is very helpful. And, like all of the great investors, Munger went through his pain and tragedy. I mean, he lost his first son at the age of 9 to leukemia, and lost his marriage, later lost an eye through a botched exam, lost his second wife after many years of marriage, of happy marriage, I think. And he said, look, I'm not going to compound the problem with self-pity. It's like, he said something that I told my mother that had, my mother's 86 and very formidable, and it had a profound effect on her as well. She said, yeah, that's absolutely true. He said, it's very helpful to treat life as a series of adversities that you can choose either to handle, what did he say? I want to not gobble this. He said, use them as an opportunity to behave well, not badly. I'm gobbling it slightly. You'll see the exact quote in the chapter that I wrote about him called Don't Be a Fool. But this idea of facing adversities that he said as you get older, particularly, they come thick and fast, and use them as an opportunity to decide, but I'm going to try to behave well despite this adversity. So it's not that, when you become super rich, as I'm sure some of you in here know, that you cease to have problems. I've seen, because I know these guys well enough, I see them with their kids who become bulimic, or their wives who don't love them anymore, or their own depression, or their sense of not getting terrible results after they worked incredibly hard. They all suffer. They all go through adversity. But the ability to be resilient in the face of adversity and to use it and to say, no, this is an opportunity to behave well, to be honest about my mistakes and to learn from it. It's very, very powerful.
Yeah, there's one thing that struck me with Munger. He lost an eye, and this guy just wants to read. I mean, he doesn't do meetings, and all he wants to do is read all day. And then there was a time where he was at risk of losing his sight.
Yeah.
And what did he do?
Well, Monish said to me that Dorothy, Munger's assistant, said to him at one point, why did you send him that? It needs to be in 24, the print 24 point, because he couldn't see anything. And Munger just said to Monish, yeah, I might lose my other eye. But he said, so I'll have to learn Braille. And so there was something so sort of heroically upbeat and resilient about this guy. And to the very end, I mean, there was something very extraordinary in the last year or so of his life. He just like kept sharing with people all these. I mean, it was a bit like Leonard Cohen or becoming more of a star in old age. Like Munger became like this celebrity in his 90s. So all of these CEOs and would just flock to his house, and he would spend 4 or 5 hours talking to them, giving them advice for no reason. And likewise with me. I mean, I got invited to talk to him on this Zoom breakfast about my books. I'm going to teach him and Lou Simpson, one of the greatest investors of all time, how to invest. It's like, I said to my mother at the time, I feel like I'm going to tell Tiger Woods how to improve his golf swing. But it was incredibly important for me. I mean, because he said, this is one of the best investment books ever written. And it was, although then he said it'll be about as popular as rat poison. Because he's like, you show that a lot of what other people do just actually doesn't work. And so it won't be very popular, but he said it's a tremendous contribution. And afterwards, I said to one of the guys on that call how powerful and important that validation had been for me. And he said, this venture capitalist in California, he said, in my very last call with Charlie, he said to me, I've been a better investor than you, but you've been a better father than me. And he said that was so important to me. It's like being blessed by his mentor and teacher. And so again, these things give you a clue. When Munger says you've been a better father than me, it's like him saying, here's the secret to good relationships. It's like you come away from that and you're like, I don't really want at the end of my life to say, well, I was a really good writer, I was a really good investor, I was really smart, but I wasn't a good father. And as I was coming in, actually, I was feeling annoyed about something for various reasons, and my daughter, who's 23, Madeline, sent me these photos of her as a little child with me, and it said, good parenting. And I was like, that's pretty good. That's really, really important to me.
Okay, so just continuing in this theme.
Of course, half the time she tells me I'm a crap parent, but at least I'm celebrating this one moment.
I want to continue on the theme of good, and there was something that struck me in your book, and I'm mindful of time because I do want to leave. I see we have a mic, and so I want to leave a bit of time for questions. But you profiled Pabrai, Munger, Ed Thorpe, Nick Sleep, Kay Sakaria, Howard Marks, Tom Gaynor, Templeton, Buffett, Joel Greenblatt, and other famous investing legends. And then you finish this book with an epilogue entitled Beyond Rich, where you try and summarize all of this stuff. And you profile a guy that I've never heard of before, Arnold Vandenberg, who's a Holocaust survivor and a money manager. He's not the richest, he's not famous, yet you write, if I had to choose just one role model from all of the remarkable investors I've interviewed over the last quarter of a century, it would be him. So it was really interesting to me that that's who you chose. So I'm wondering if you could tell us why.
Yeah, Arnold is the most wonderful human being. And I often think of this in these terms that he's definitely not the most successful investor. He's been a very successful investor over 50 years now, but he's not the most successful, he's not the richest, not the most powerful, not the most famous. But I think of him as the most successful human being I've met in the investing world. And part of it is that the odds of success were so terrible for him. I mean, so many of the people I write about, they would get, they would go to Harvard Business School or Wharton or stuff. They were born sort of 3 feet from the goal line. And Arnold was the exact opposite. I mean, Arnold spent the first 2 years of his life in hiding in Amsterdam because he was born on the same street as Anne Frank. And so he was hidden behind this sort of fake wall in the house of this Christian family called the Bunts, who protected him and his parents at great risk to themselves, because they were a Jewish family at a time when, you know, Jews were just being sent to Auschwitz in Amsterdam. And at a certain point, his parents decided it was too risky to have him and his brother Sigmund hiding behind this fake wall, because if the Nazis came in and searched the house and one of the kids cried, they would all get sent to Auschwitz, and the women and kids were the first ones to get killed. And so his parents got in touch with someone from the underground, from the Dutch underground, and this basically probably about 16 or 17-year-old girl, I figured out ages afterwards, was called Olga Krommelin, and I name her because I think it's right to name her. She comes and takes Arnold and smuggles him across the country and hides him in a Christian orphanage. And so she risks her life to do this. It's an absolutely extraordinary act of bravery. And so he spends the next 4 years in this orphanage, and he has no idea that he's been sent there, you know, not because his mother doesn't love him, but because they're trying to save his life. And his parents do end up in Auschwitz, but amazingly survive. And they come to pick him up in 1944, after he's been there for 4 years. And he basically can't walk anymore because he's been so malnourished, and he's just sort of shuffling along on his knees. And he doesn't recognize his parents. And he said, I just didn't care. I just wanted to leave. I would have gone with anyone. And they end up moving to LA. And he's like this really weak, puny kid who's like prey in this terrible area where he's just constantly beaten up. And so what's unbelievable about Arnold is you have this guy with the worst start in life, and he comes out of the Holocaust super damaged by it. I mean, you know, he overhears his mother talking to a psychologist, and they're discussing that he's probably got brain damage because he's been so malnourished. So he believes he's really stupid, barely makes it through high school, and then gets married. His wife runs off with another guy, so he's just full of rage, and his father used to beat him up. I mean, it was just, you know, terrible, terrible. And then gradually, he transforms his life, and he becomes the most extraordinary human being. And so he teaches himself to invest. He starts his company in 1974 with no track record, no client, no office, and no money. And over the last 50 years, has managed to rack up this really great record, and is just the loveliest, kindest, most decent, most charitable human being. And so part of what I'm trying to do in the epilogue is kind of to show, well, how did he do it? And if he could transform his life, then that kind of gives you a sense that, well, me with my little problems, you know, my parents were pretty loving, difficult, but loving. You know, why can't all of us kind of transform our lives? And without going into too much detail about it, because I know we're very limited on time, what he really did is he took control of his inner landscape. He really took control of his thoughts, and he became obsessed with self-hypnosis, among other things. And so he would just and because he didn't have a college education, he wasn't like a college-educated cynic or skeptic like me, you know, coming from Oxford and Columbia and thinking, no, that would be terribly naive to think that. He actually took it seriously when he read these self-help books that said, no, you can change your world by changing the way you think. And so he became this incredible example of how actually you can transform your life by changing the way you talk to yourself, changing the way you behave to other people. And one of the things that he found out, he went to this amazing psychiatrist, and he said to the he was very depressed for a few years after his wife left, and he goes to this psychiatrist, and he says to the guy, I don't understand why that girl saved my life, that teenager, and why would her father allow her to do it? And the psychiatrist said, well, I can tell you, that's simple. And he's like, tell me, what's simple about it? And the guy says, well, for some people, their life is more important than their principles. And for other people, their principles are worth more than their life. And so Arnold led this incredibly principled life. And so you see this guy who's just become really loving, really kind, really charitable, really compassionate, and at the same time won't allow himself any, like if he started to have really negative thoughts or to have fear or to have anger, he would say, no, I'm a loving person. He would just repeat this over and over to himself. And at a certain point, he becomes this really loving person. And so I think this gets at another of the really key takeaways from studying the great investors, which is, it's yes, you want to share, yes, you want to have some money so you have a cushion, so you have some safety, so you don't have to worry about stuff. Yes, you want to emphasize relationships, but you also need to take care of your inner landscape. You need to actually, I quote Milton, who after the great poet, who after he went blind, dictated Paradise Lost, and he talked about how the mind can make a heaven of hell or hell of heaven. And so we all know super rich people who are in absolute misery. And then we know people who have much less and they're full of appreciation, kindness, and love. And so you see Arnold and you think, okay, let me be more like Arnold. And so he is a kind of beacon to me, and incredibly generous. He would do things like, he was worried that I was really lazy and indolent, so he sent me a trampoline. And it was like, of course I gave it to the next door neighbor's kids, but don't tell Arnold.
I was listening to the podcast. Apparently trampolining is 3 times more effective than running, which I can't believe it. I haven't tried it, but that's why
Arnold will be like 86 and he does a call with you and he's on his trampoline, like marching on the trampoline. It's an amazing thing.
Okay, so I actually want to, I think we only have a few minutes left, right? So maybe what we can do is if we have time for 1 or 2 questions, if anybody has any. There's a mic.
Yeah.
What would be one of the most life-changing books that you've read that you would recommend everyone else read?
Well, I'll tell you the book that had the biggest impact on Arnold, which is a 1901 book called From Poverty to Power. And it was written by a guy who was a devout Christian who was also steeped in Buddhism. And you read it now, and in some ways it's really old-fashioned, in some ways it's really beautiful and really powerful. And there's a collection called Mind is the Master that includes that. And I would read that because you start to see, you start to see that it infused everything that Arnold did to transform his life. And one of the things in that book is that it talks about rich people whose lives are a kind of a disaster. Because they're kind of morally base in some way. And he says, and he talks about how, you really want to work on yourself. That's the key. And so this was hugely empowering for Arnold because he decided, well, instead of being full of rage and anger towards my parents and towards all the anti-Semites, and 39 members of his family were killed in the Holocaust. I mean, he had a lot of reason to be angry. He said, no, I'm going to forgive the Germans, because I don't want to be, traumatized by my own hatred and anger. I'm letting go of it, and it's a gift to myself. And so he remade himself, and he became this incredibly principled human being. And I think it gets at a really fundamental lesson in life that you can't really control a lot of the external stuff, but this is one of the great lessons of Stoic philosophy, which also plays a big part in the book, is you can control yourself, your own intentions, your own behavior, your own integrity. And so in a world where your pavilion can fall in a sinkhole in Florida, you have to kind of distinguish what are the things I can control and what can't I control. And the thing I can control is my own attitude of mind. And that's very, very consistent in the happiest investors I've covered. I would say that ability to take very seriously, how am I going to get peace of mind? And so it's surprising just how many of these guys meditate as well, because they're great pragmatists. And so they think about, well, so how am I going to have equanimity in a world where, there's so much volatility and there's so much turmoil and I have so little control, and yet I work so hard, but I don't know the result, don't have control over the result. So to do something like meditation very consistently, where you're like, okay, let me have, I know that I'm comfortable here in this moment. That's very powerful.
Okay, so I think one more and then we'll have to.
One day I'm just going to answer like one question in the whole thing. It'll be like, when one of those concerts where John Coltrane would just play my favorite things for like 2 hours. Be the world's most long-winded answer. Sorry.
After interviewing all those people and realizing that cloning was the way to go, what gave you the ambition to start on your own and clone rather than just invest in what you thought was maybe the best of the people who you were interviewing?
Yeah, cloning has become really important for me in terms of going through life and figuring out where's the low-hanging fruit. that I resist cloning myself. You know, all the things, I mean, even when something as minor as doing my website, years ago I was like, well, someone's got williamgreen.com, and I look at Michael Lewis's website and it says michaellewiswrites.com, and so now it's williamgreenwrites.com. So I would just systematically clone very simple things like that. But there's also a caveat, which I realized in writing that chapter about Monish, which is you have to clone in a way that suits your personality and your temperament and your talents. And so, you know, Monish, for example, has this super concentrated portfolio. I mean, Monish at one point, I think, had about 80% of his money in 3 stocks. But he has kind of no emotion, practically. He's like a lot of these people, he's very unemotional when it comes to money. He just sort of makes these bets. I would have a heart attack if I had all my money in 3 stocks. So you have to go through life, I think, saying, okay, here's the low-hanging fruit where I can learn from someone who's much smarter and wiser than me. And here's the stuff where actually, yeah, that suits him, but it doesn't suit me. And so it's kind of intelligent cloning in a way that suits your temperament and your strengths. But I think the stuff that I've ended up cloning has been the stuff not really related to money in a way. It's really understanding, oh, so wait, it's all about relationships. It's all about sharing more. It's all about gaining control over my inner state. And so I think because when I was working on this book, I was so maniacally focused and driven on it. I mean, I literally didn't take a full weekend or a vacation in 5 years. I still missed my deadline by 2 years. And so my publisher was not happy. And so I really let my health go. I didn't exercise much. I didn't meditate enough. I was okay as a father and husband, but I let all of my relationships kind of wilt on the vine. And I think since the book came out, I've been thinking, no, I can't do that anymore, even when I'm incredibly busy. I know from these people that I have to clone this aspect of a rich and happy life.
So for your next book, you just got to call Mo. He cranks them out in like 2 months. Okay, so I think we're going to wrap it up. I want to first of all thank all of you for being here and supporting Prime Quadrant and Holland Bloor View and staying awake in the last session of the day. You know, so 3 cheers for you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's a great pleasure.
Thanks to William, especially for flying here. And Mo, thanks for having us.
Oh, thank you.
So this is the little...
It's much better looking than I am. But thank you.